Thank you, Don. In October of 2021, Florida Tax Watch, with support and guidance of the Environmental Defense Fund, published a report called "A Rising Tide Sinks All Homes." And the purpose of this report was to look at the impacts of climate change on every sector of Florida's economy. Next slide, please. Oh.
Sorry. Yeah.
Are you doing this or am I?
I think you're doing it.
Okay.
There we go. Do the great button.
Okay, no. It was, all right, it was looking there. Okay. I can see the screens, but I can't read them. So if you guys will indulge me, I'm going to work with a prop here today. But the physical effects of climate change on Florida's economy are generational and existential. Florida's economy is based heavily on real estate development and the tourism industry. And the long-term effects of climate change on our economy are going to be the most severe on those things that make Florida, Florida. That's our coastal resources, our theme parks, all of the natural attractions and man-made attractions that make people want to leave Kansas and move to Florida and make people want to retire here. So preserving and protecting those resources is critical going forward. If you look at the slide, in the year 2025, there are 64,000 homes in Florida today that in 2045 will be subject to chronic inundation. Now, chronic inundation is defined as if 10% or more of your usable land area is underwater 26 times a year, that's every 2 weeks, then your property is chronically inundated. That the value of those properties right now is about $26 billion, and that chronic inundation is projected to take about $350 million off the local government tax rolls. Question was asked in the last panel, why do we build on barrier islands? Because that's where the property tax revenues are. In the year 2100, 10% of all the homes in Florida are going to be subject to chronic inundation. That's going to take about $5 billion off the local government property tax rolls. And again, when we get to the end of the century, 40% of all the homes in the country that are subject to chronic inundation and 35% of all the commercial properties that are subject will be in Florida. So it's going to get wet. This is a snapshot, excuse me, of Florida's pre-COVID economy. And I want to apologize up front. The millions of dollars should be billions of dollars. In 2020, our gross domestic product was just under $1 trillion. Today, I think it's about $1.4 trillion. So there's an agricultural sector and 10 non-agricultural sectors. And we have those ranked in this chart based on their contribution to the gross domestic product and to the employment. I want to look at the financial activity sector, the first. These are the bankers, the lending institutions, the real estate companies, and the insurance companies. And right now, these people are issuing billions of dollars every year in mortgages. And a lot of those mortgages are along the coastal and flood-prone areas. Now, as climate changes, as the sea levels rise, as we have more frequent, more severe storms, it's going to become more and more difficult to get 30-year mortgages in some of these coastal properties. As we get better with our flood maps, the FEMA flood maps, it's going to be very tough to get a 30-year mortgage when the flood maps show the property you want to buy is going to be underwater in 20 years. So that is a huge issue. The interest rates, if you can get a mortgage in those areas, you're going to pay pretty significant interest rates because those are going to go up as well. Mortgage delinquencies, if you get to the point where your mortgage is underwater, no pun intended, you're going to see a lot more defaults and people walking away from those properties. The property insurance company, we've had 2 special sessions on property insurance in the last year, and we still haven't fixed it. Legislature is dealing with that issue this session. But I think it's safe to say that as the climate changes, insurance companies are going to issue or renew fewer policies every year, and the premiums that you pay if you can get the insurance are going to be significantly higher than they are today. The next sector I want to talk about is trade, transportation, and utilities. We've got billions of dollars tied up in roads, bridges, seaports, spaceports that are going to be subject to the effects of climate change. And also, we depend very heavily on this network to move people and goods around Florida and from Florida to other states. And if those infrastructures are damaged, then our ability to move people and resources and goods is diminished. For utilities, utility industry, you're going to pay higher utility rates. You're going to use more electricity. The rates are going to go up. So that is coming. And again, supply chain disruptions, because we use the roads and airports to move goods around. Manufacturers are going to experience supply chain disruptions. Products are going to cost more. They're going to be less available. So you're going to have to deal with that. The professional and business services sector, again, is one of those that has both risks and opportunities. The risk is going to be to business operations. Climate change and the effects of that are going to affect how companies do business. But it also gives businesses an opportunity to do one thing that businesses do well, and that's innovate. And we've seen that with the COVID pandemic. We saw new technologies put into play. We have remote working, telehealth, your ability to contact your doctor on your laptop, and things like that. So the professional and business services sector affords opportunities to innovate. One sector that is really subject to the effects of climate change is the government sector. Excuse me. Government collects property taxes based on the value of these properties, many of these coastal properties. And they use those revenues to fund parks, police, and other vital public services. With climate change, if those coastal properties suffer damage, or if their tax value goes down, then local governments are going to have less money to fund things like not only police and fire and education services, but also to fund the mitigation measures that are going to be needed because of the climate change. Florida also has a pretty significant military complex. We have a lot of military bases in the state, and a lot of those, like Pensacola NAS and Key West and MacDill, are on the water. So the climate change, sea level rises, has the ability not only to affect that, but it also puts national security at risk, because these facilities, they have to be ready. The next sector is education and health services. The real risk to the education sector is the flooding of schools and the disruption in learning that storms cause. When I was the director of emergency management, when Andrew hit like a week before the schools were going to open. So we use the schools for shelters. So the kids come back to school and their school is a shelter. So for health services, you're probably going to see higher rates of illness, more health-related issues. The mortality rate due to excessive heat is projected to increase as well. The construction industry, again, that's another one of those sectors where there is risk and there are opportunities. The risk is from the excessive heat days. The research suggests that there could be up to the construction industry could lose 33 days a year just because of the heat, because it's too hot to work outside. But the construction industry also has the potential to benefit greatly from this, because all these measures that are put into place to mitigate the climate change effects, the moving infrastructure, the elevating homes and stuff like that, construction industry does all of that. So I think that with respect to the construction industry, it will offset any of the risks. Leisure and hospitality, this is our tourism industry. The impacts on the tourism industry are going to be extremely severe because, again, these are coastal areas. These are our natural resources that people come to Florida to see and why they move here. By the middle of this century, the impact on our tourism industry is going to be about $53 billion a year. And then by 2021, that is projected to go to about $117 billion a year. And that is a crippling impact on that industry. Next industry is manufacturing. Manufacturing, people think of manufacturing as a dirty, grimy industry, and it's really not. Florida's manufacturing industry is a clean industry. We do a lot of building for the space program and for a number of clean technologies, but still the big risk there is the supply chain disruptions. It's going to be harder for the manufacturers to get the components and the parts they need to build and sell the products that they make. The information, the communications sector of the economy, again, is one of those that has both risks and opportunities. The risks, it's just a disruption and knocking out facilities, knocking down cell phone towers and things like that. Through technology, though, and through the connectivity, which is really the critical issue in this sector, through that connectivity, people can work at home, they can contact their doctors, they can do a lot of things that are because of the communication technology. And then the final sector is the agricultural sector. And the impacts there are going to be related to heat, the need for water, crop damage. The farmers are going to pay more for crop insurance. They're going to have lower crop yields. Livestock mortality and things like that. So those are the kind of experiences you're going to see with the agriculture sector. So in our report, we identify, I think there are 9 recommendations in the report, and I kind of want to go through those quickly. First one is develop targeted strategies to reduce regional emissions. When you look at greenhouse gases and effects like that, that's really a global effect. So there's not much Florida can do by itself to reduce greenhouse emissions, but what Florida can do is establish itself as a leader in solar power, wind power, and some of these other technologies that do reduce the greenhouse emissions, things that take more cars off the road, people working from home instead of driving to their office and back every day, those kind of effects. Second, slow and managed retreat from the coast. Sounds good. It's a tough sell, though. This is going to require a very carefully thought out and funded strategy if we're going to move people, infrastructure, and properties away from these coastal areas. Third recommendation is to come up with a systematic and an organized way to buy down the risk. If we can do things like by elevating homes and better building construction codes, things to mitigate the risk, then over time we can buy down that risk, because we've seen around in this area, you've all seen the damage estimates and what it's going to cost to rebuild, and they are staggering numbers. One of my favorites, ending or modifying government programs that encourage development in risky areas. And the poster child for this one is the National Flood Insurance Program. Coming in a close second is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And I say that based on years of experience in the field of emergency management and land use planning. Next recommendation is investing in the protection and restoration of natural buffers. We saw in an earlier presentation, these surge canals occur where there are pathways, and they tend to follow that. It's the path of least resistance. So if we can invest in mangrove planting, anything we can do to restore the features that naturally occur along these areas, I think it buys us time, if nothing else. Strategic investments in beach renourishment. We've talked today about seawalls and why they fail and why they don't fail. My experience has been seawalls generally work good until water gets behind them, then they wash them out from behind. But there are strategic advantages to harden or target certain parts of the coast. I think when Ian crossed Florida and went up the East Coast, I think all of you saw the photos along Daytona Beach where there are houses just hanging over the edge ready to drop into the ocean. So there are some things in Florida worth protecting, worth hardening a little bit. So investing in that type of renourishment and other types of armoring of the coast, there are advantages to doing that. And I do want to say these recommendations are in no particular order or priority. These are just the way they came out of my head. I'm sorry. Promoting land use and construction practices that improve resiliency. After hurricanes like Ian, it is not uncommon for government to revisit the building codes to see what worked and what didn't work. I've seen photos of damage along Fort Myers Beach area where homes that were built in 2000 fared an awful lot better than homes that were built in 1960. So I think anything we can do, elevation, hardening, the just better wind resistant features and stuff like that, all of those will help. And then the final recommendation is to do nothing, just maintain the status quo, just give up. And we really can't afford to do that. It's doing nothing is no longer an option. I mean, the time has come to act. We have to do something if it's not passed. And in closing, the effects of climate change are very complex, and no sector of Florida's economy is going to be spared the impacts of climate change. Concept that I want to put in your head is one of fiscal sustainability. And it reflects a balance between the revenues that come in that local governments need to make the improvements to mitigate the effects of climate change. All the revenue, the major revenue sources are the property tax rolls from these expensive coastal properties. And the local governments need that money to fund moving infrastructure or elevating lift stations and stuff like that. But the problem is, as climate change gets worse, there's less property tax revenue in these areas to fund those improvements. So local government's got to find a balance between the amount that they're spending to mitigate and the amount of money that's coming in. So that is it. I want to thank you for letting me share my thoughts with you. I'll look forward to any questions you have. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. Can you hear me okay from here? Yeah. Yes. Thanks for being here. I noticed that this morning agriculture was number 5 in the topic of interest there. So I was afraid, I was not really optimistic about this one.
But the economy was 3rd.
Well, good, you see, but much better than me. So what I want to do today is share with you some of the work we have been doing with the agroclimate project at the University of Florida. It really started more than 15 years ago with a grant from the USDA Risk Management Agency. The idea there was to develop decision tools that were targeting crops that are not well protected by insurance, like underserved by crop insurance. And from that time to now, we have been maintaining and developing new ideas, and many times it's grant funded, so we go this way, that way, but we have kept the idea, the original idea, which is to develop solutions. When you talk to farmers, you can talk about climate change and things like that, but they say, so what? They say, well, what we're going to do? And they're really looking for solutions. So I want to start with this slide, just sharing what I see as our mission, which is to add action and increase action and add value to climate and weather data. So that's what we pursue all the time. And in many ways, I am just formalizing what you have heard here today all day. We need three main components for that. Number one, we need data. And I always stress that because data is not sexy. It's not really, people don't talk about this, but we need good data. And I always say that bad or wrong data is worse than no data. For that, in Florida, we have a Mesonet, the weather stations, the phone, Florida Agricultural Weather Network. It is good because the stations are normally outside the urban areas, so it's represents better what we're experiencing in the fields. But there are 42 weather stations. I mean, nowadays, I'm really concerned that as the prices go down, you see many farmers buying weather stations. And unfortunately, they don't maintain the weather station. They don't keep them calibrated or clean. And then we see lots of problems with data. We're more and more using gridded data. Gridded data is great. It's many times it covers, well, first of all, it covers a larger area, right? If you have a weather station, you're restricted to that area nearby. With the gridded data, we don't have that issue, but we talked this morning many times about the spatial resolution. It could be 50 kilometers by 50 kilometers. That's not good enough. So we need to bring this down. We also have an issue with gridded data, which is called the latency time. How soon can I get this data? If I'm trying to develop a solution for a farmer or a recommendation, many times he wants to know now what's going on now, and not hear from me, well, yesterday you should have done that. So we need to look at this as well. So gridded data is great, but we have some issues still with that. Once you have the data, you move to the second step, which is you need the models, right? You need to simulate what's going to happen there. You can tell me it's not going to rain the next week, and the real question is how this is going to affect my crop. Should I irrigate? Is it okay? Is it in a phase that maybe it doesn't need water, so it's not going to doesn't need much water, so it's not going to be greatly affected. But so we need to play with this what-if scenarios, and we need to keep track of that. And the only way to do that is to have the models. Now, once you have the models, you don't expect a farmer to run the models and look at the graphs and the tables. They wanted to hear something, I should spray my crop today or not. So you need to go to the recommendation. That's where the value is. And many times we have to collect a lot of data to get that final in simple recommendation. This is what really they're looking for. And of course, we need the forecasting as well. This is in a nutshell what I see the system that we need to put in place to really make this effective. So moving on, I'm going to talk a little bit about three systems that we have. Agroclimate.org is the original one, is where we have a lot of the decision tools. We have a lot of educational materials as well. Then there is a system that I have been developing for the USDA NAS, which really monitors. It's designed to monitor risk. It's really not designed to make any recommendation, but just let you know what's going on in a certain place. All the data is aggregated at the county level because that's how they report crop yield. So that's what we do. And more recently, a project with the USDA Office of Energy and Environmental Policy, where we look at agroclimate indicators. So those are the indicators that, we talk about rainfall, precipitation, but when you go to a crop, you want to talk about evapotranspiration. Like we had a fantastic review of evapotranspiration this morning. We need to talk about disease risk or chill accumulation and other ideas that are more related, growing degree days, things like that that are important, and translate that variable into something that is important for the crop. So I'm going to highlight a couple of tools we have now. The chill accumulation is a big one now, not for you guys here. It's really important. Chill accumulation is really important for temperate fruit. If we're growing blueberries or strawberries or peaches, you need during the winter a certain amount of chill hours, we call it chill, that will prepare that tree to provide a good fruit set and to have quality and yield. So there are many ways we can track that. The easiest one is just chill hours, we call it, which is the number of hours between 32 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit. If we look at this, it really doesn't make any headline, but if we look at the trends in all the weather stations we have in Florida, that particular weather station is in Gainesville, in Florida, where I am in Alachua County. And you can see, and it's hard to talk about trends when we just have 20 years or so of data. But actually, if you look at all the weather stations, you're going to see this decreasing trend of chill accumulation. Why is that important? Well, if you're going to establish a blueberry grove or peaches, you're going to buy something, you're going to establish something that needs a certain amount of chill hours, the varieties that you choose. And if you're not getting that, you're going to have to apply hydrogen cyanamide, or you're not going to have good fruit sets. And this is going to be a bad investment. And it's not like an annual crop that this year didn't go well, next year you change. It's something that's there for 10, 15 years. So you need to track that very well. So this is a very popular tool for us here in Central Florida, North Florida. This just shows that the tracking this year. You could see that the brown maroon line there is this year up to February 8th, I believe. Then you have the blue line, which is the last year, and the yellow line is the long-term trend. So you can see that we are below, and this has been the case for the last quite 5-10 years. We have been below the long-term average for chill accumulation. We're planning to improve this too this year, but we don't need to talk about that. The other thing that I see a tremendous potential are disease alert systems. I mean, every fungal disease, for instance, they have a range of temperature that they feel comfortable with, right? And they also need some humidity. So as climate change, we're going to see diseases coming to Florida. We may see some others that will be disappearing, maybe because it's getting too warm for them. But we need to track this quite well. And I found that this is one of the tools that farmers most like. Once they get the confidence in using that tool. For instance, strawberry growers in Florida for more than 10 years now, we have been developing this one with a plant pathologist. And what you see there is the risk for two important diseases, anthracnose and botrytis. And they track this every day. Well, normally, farmers would apply fungicide in a calendar basis every 7 days. Why? Because it's very expensive to grow strawberries, and you don't want to risk that. So you want to apply, you want to make sure that you're not going to lose your crop. So with this tool, we have seen, I avoid saying a decrease because actually there are situations where you may apply even more often than that. But in the most cases, what we are seeing is a decrease of the number of applications that you do. And that means not only it's good for the environment, but for the farmer, it's mainly good for the pocket. I mean, they save money doing that. It's interesting, tracking this for the strawberries. During the last 3 years, we had 3 La Niñas, if you're familiar with the La Niñas. Normally, they bring drier climate to Florida. And if you, the strawberry season is basically from November through March. And you can see there during the last 3 years, most of the risk has been for this particular location, Plant City, where they grow lots of strawberry. You can see that the risk has been either low or moderate, not too many occasions with high risk. So they have been used to a low disease pressure. Now, next year, this might change. We're gonna probably have an El Niño that brings more rainfall to Florida, more humidity. So this might change. Another thing I wanna say is that we're looking at expanding this to using gridded data. And a quick comment there is that one of the challenges we have is that gridded for disease risk, we need hourly data. So hourly data is not always, I mean, we have been using RTMA, which is a NOAA product, reanalysis data. But again, it's the latency that is the issue. We don't want to say tell a farmer, well, you should have applied yesterday. I'm sorry. No, you need to. So we're going to have to use forecasting. But I see a lot of potential in this kind of tool. The other thing I want to show is that the risk, the big map, it's based on two maps, temperature and leaf wetness. So as temperature change, our risk will change. So this is what I meant by looking at different diseases and simulating them and see how this is going to happen, how this is going to behave in the future, because some of them may even disappear. Quickly, this is the NAS system. We track several of those variables as well. Interestingly enough, some of the things we're noticing is nighttime temperature increasing in Florida with this. And some other things that we also track for them is the drought index. I'm glad that there was such a fantastic explanation about evapotranspiration this morning. That's exactly what we're tracking. There is a soil water balance. So we do a daily soil water balance using gridded data prism 4x4 kilometers. And the idea there is that if we don't have enough moisture in the soil to provide the plant with the need, the water requirements that the plant has that particular day, then we have a stress. And if we monitor that every day, we know that this might be happening at a time that is more critical, for instance, flowering. So when we talk about agricultural drought, it's different from meteorological drought. I mean, you have to know what crop is there, how much water that particular crop needs, and what is the phase of development of that crop. Because if there is no crop, there is no agricultural drought, let's put it this way. But that's what we need to look at if we're talking about agriculture. So this is hard to show, to see. You probably can't see it there, but we can aggregate information at the county level for any county in the US now. And we kind of highlight what percentile it is, that particular observation, with respect to the long-term trend for that, or long-term data for that particular variable. And this was showing July of 2022 in Florida, aggregating at the Florida districts and looking at precipitation. So I always think that climate variables, they have to tell the same story, right? So the upper two rows there are the Northeast and Northwest districts. You see above average rainfall. So you see the temperature amplitude decreasing. Why? You have clouds. You see the difference between the minimum and the maximum are different. They are decreased with that. So you have to look at the data and see everything is telling you the same story. And of course, you want to highlight either the very high percentiles or very low percentiles, so you know how this might be affecting a crop. The last thing I want to show is the climate indicators. I mean, this was inspired in the publication, that publication from the USDA, which is fairly interesting. It's again talking about the indicators that are really important for crops. And if we start to look at potential effects of climate change, we want to base on climate indicators like this one. And again, you can, we're developing this tool so that you can basically drop a pin anywhere in the US and get some overview of what's happening there. This was in North Florida there. Rainfall in a particular period of time. I can't see it from here. But then you see it was during the winter because you see below average there during the last 3 years, and that's partially driven by the La Nina that we experienced. So this is all I want to talk. I really don't. We haven't done a lot with climate change itself, and the reason is simple. Someone mentioned here today that if talking with someone that is dealing with the problems they had with Hurricane Ian, they're more concerned about solving the problems today, what's happening now, instead of thinking about strategies for 50 years down the road. With farmers, it's the same idea. I mean, they really are concerned about being in business next year, how much they're going to make, if they're going to survive. So it's very hard if you just start talking about, oh, I think this is going to happen in 30 years from now. They're going to be curious, but they're not going to pay a lot of attention to you. So I think we need to combine everything. Start adapting for the next season is a way to learn about adaptation and think about 10 years, 20 years down the road. So that's it. Thank you very much.
These chairs are nice, but I'm not that tall, so I think it's about the same if I'm sitting or standing. I want to thank you all so much for being here. I know you've been a very courteous audience, but from some of the questions and the comments at the start, I know there are some spicy thoughts and ideas out there. So I would encourage you to share them in the Q&A or come up and talk to me afterwards. Thank you to Dawn for the introduction and Jennifer for the invitation. And of course, you all for your attention. Very generous. I'm Brian Smoliak with 2 Degrees Adapt. I'm an entrepreneur on purpose. I'm trained as a climate scientist, and I try to show up as a servant leader. I really want to live in a world where everyone can go outside confidently, connect with nature, and come back home with a story of resilience, whatever that means to each person. And so today I'm going to be telling you a story about resilient food systems, and we'll kind of get into that through a Florida context. So let's jump in. Of course, it starts here in Florida where we are, which is a great place to be telling the story because of Florida's rich, environment, the subtropical climate, the enterprising people. I mean, it's why we're here today. We can see this in a map from the USDA that shows for 2022, the primary crop grown in a particular area or the primary natural environment. So from, sugarcane and citrus in the south to cotton and peanuts in the north, there is just a rich diversity of crops grown in Florida. Of course, there's lots of grass and pasture too, where we have horses and livestock. So, Bob talked about how, from a GDP perspective, Florida, agriculture might be low there, but that low percentage is a very important percentage. And I'll be talking about, why that is as we move on. If we zoom in on Southwest Florida, where we are, you see that there is this patchwork of sort of grass and pasture, of citrus groves, of urban areas in gray and natural areas in the darker green. And then, of course, water. So it's this very interesting patchwork. In the Midwest where I come from, it's just sort of expansive agriculture and really concentrated urban areas. Here in Florida, it's much different. So I really just encourage you to take a moment and think about agriculture in your community or nearby you. What does that look like and what does that feel like and how do you see it show up? Do you see it in a farmer's market? Do you see it in trucks on the road? Do you see it in the supermarket? Agriculture does show up in just myriad ways in our lives. So, we talk about, as a percent of GDP for Florida, agriculture is a little lower on the list, but when we think about the U.S. value, the overall value to U.S. agriculture, Florida plays a very major role. So you think of tomatoes, citrus, bell peppers, grapefruit. These are significant percentages that Florida is contributing to U.S. agriculture as a whole. And of course, we, ship it all around the U.S. We ship it all the way around the world. So it's not a stretch at all to say that Florida helps nourish the world, right? And we nourish ourselves here too in Florida. So you can go to a farmer's market and get locally grown produce. That is a very unique thing that you don't see in every part of the world. So as you see here, we can ship that all over the world in weeks and days even. And, I think part of how I've learned this is, through partnership with EDF, we recently completed a project studying Florida fruits and vegetables. And so, I think we can start to talk about how climate will have an impact on that. But from just a baseline perspective, this is kind of how I want to set the economic scene. Whenever someone brings up systems, this book by Donella Meadows comes to mind. It's called Thinking in Systems. It's a really great book. It's a good primer. And so, Donella talks about how, we can't fully understand systems, but we can study them and observe their behavior, and we can make inferences about systems. And I think it's very important to do that, because when we make insights about systems, we're able to see the leverage points and get in there and make little interventions and kind of think about how we might want to redesign systems, especially ones that we have influence over. So when it comes to food systems, this is what it looks like. It's showed linearly here, but of course systems are circular. And it's very important to keep that in mind. Systems are interconnected components that have a particular purpose. I'll say that again. Systems are interconnected components with a particular purpose. And so for a food system, it could be feeding the world. It could be making a profit. There are different ways to look at it, and different observers will have different viewpoints. So we have production, we have processing, distribution, and then finally markets and consumption. And, when you think about what are the flows that are working through that system, what are they? It's materials, the actual seeds and inputs that go into creating the products. It's labor. Agriculture takes work. It's very hard work to produce and to move food around. And then, of course, it's hard work to consume the food too and cook it, right? So, there's a lot of work involved there. I think also it's important to think about how policy and then just environmental conditions, climate, those shape the system from the outside. So those are leverage points too. And I don't want us to kind of, lose sight of that. And of course, on September 28th, 2022, the food system received a pretty big shock in the form of, Hurricane Ian. We had life-threatening storm surge move in. We had extreme precipitation and hurricane force winds. It made a big impact on the power system. You see here how, the lights went out literally. We had roads blocked, lots of interference with life as we know it. And, when we look at the impacts of the hurricane, we heard that, NOAA said maybe more than $113 billion. So this is, very impactful, and it's the costliest hurricane in Florida history. Let's not lose sight of that. So when we look at how did the agriculture system, food system, how is it impacted? I think, of course, storm surge on the coast, very important. But when we look inland, it's really the winds and the rains that, created a big impact. Across the top of the screen, you see some pictures of orchards, fields flooded, infrastructure thrown around. And then, of course, businesses that either distribute or sell food merchandise, food products, those were impacted as well. State agencies have put together a composite index of the impact of the hurricane. And of the 53 counties that were impacted, 50 of those counties had 100% of ag lands impacted. So it seems like no one was spared in some way, right? And I think with all that impact, what are growers supposed to do? Do they look out at their flooded field and just give up and, pack up and get a job somewhere else? Is that what, growers do? Well, no, it's not. Growers are resilient. And I think that this first threshold really is about a mindset. I think when you talk about resilient Florida, that is not an empty phrase, right? When you just look at the response to the hurricane, you I think feel it and you see it all around you. So that's, line workers and first responders that are out there, putting their safety or putting other safeties ahead of theirs, and you see farmers like Dr. Ava Warden of Warden Farms, who, went out and, saw these trees stripped of their foliage, saw trees pushed over, but also saw, this field of specialty pumpkins, tropical pumpkins you see behind her, that were able to hold on, and they're actually flowering in the weeks following the hurricane. So there are resilient systems, and growers are resilient. They're experimenters at heart, and so they're out there, figuring it out, just like the rest of us were, when we're assessing damage after the storm. So I think that resilience is very notable. But if the storm wasn't enough, need I remind you of pests and disease? We've heard about that a bit earlier, and I think when it comes to these psyllids that are transmitting the citrus greening, this is very significant. If that weren't enough, there are other growers that are experiencing diseases like these watermelon viruses that have been discovered recently, creating these crinkle leaf. And they're so new that, at this point, scientists don't have even enough information to be able to predict them. They're just trying to observe and see what's going on. And then there's just, of course, the persistent threat of, mosquito-borne illnesses, whether that's to livestock or human. So, diseases, and pests are also a real challenge. So, if you're not feeling it right now, I don't know, I am. And I think that all this drama can kind of, turn heads sometimes. And it makes me think of this sort of framework of thinking about human interactions that was introduced by Cartman. It's called the drama triangle. And you have these different roles, the victim, the villain, the hero. I don't know if any of you have felt any of these roles before, or looked at society and projected these roles onto people. I think that from a victim perspective, it's often easy to feel like there are these natural and human forces that are just out of our control. We can't do anything, and it's just, oh. And then I think sometimes when we think about villains, yeah, you think of bad guys, but sometimes it's just about this desire to just control everything, or to put blame on someone else. We call the other person the villain. And then usually when there are this victim villain dynamic, a hero typically shows up, or a rescuer, and maybe not in the best way. And I think when we talk about heroes in this dynamic, it's someone who comes in and is all about, trying to help the victim. And sometimes that just enables the victim. It doesn't give them that self-agency. And sometimes it also just, puts them in a place where they can become the villain if the change that the hero is trying to produce doesn't materialize. And they say, oh, well, it's your fault. You didn't take my help the way I wanted you to take it. And it tends to be cyclical, and we get kind of stuck in this position, and it's uncomfortable. And I saw also that agriculture was kind of lower on your interest list. But if you're not sure why you should care about agriculture, think about how in Florida, when ag land gets sold, typically it's being sold for development purposes. So if you care about land use, then here's your entry point to thinking about agriculture. And there's conflict in that, right? I mean, there are probably strong opinions about land use in Florida. Am I wrong? Okay. So here's a map of 2060 projected development when they consider the pressures of 1 meter sea level rise. So when you have 1 meter sea level rise, that pushes development inland, and it pushes people to move inland. And so those red areas are where they're projecting future development. When you look out to 2070, Carr and Zwick have thought about this and have looked at, what's an alternative to all this inland development? And, there's going to be development. There's no question about that. But it's what can we do to preserve some of that best farmland? And there are very innovative strategies that we're starting to see now, whether it's, more dense urban development, whether that's easements, where the state is looking into, acquiring, getting land transferred to them by growers and then turning around and leasing it back, on a long-term lease that protects that land use. And where I come from in the Midwest, there's all kinds of debate about using prime farmland for, reasons for things other than farming. And I get that. It's important to use land for its, best purpose. And we can argue about what that is. But again, if you don't care about agriculture, here's one reason to really think about it, because it matters. So when we think about what might the future climate look like, I don't have to say a ton because we've had some great presentations today that have kind of set the scene, but simply it's going to be warmer, wetter, and wilder. So from a warmer perspective, we've seen that there's this projection for an increase in days above 95 degrees, very hot, that can affect people's ability to work outdoors, whether that's in agriculture or in the hospitality industry. It's a challenge. We also see in terms of it getting wetter, there's this interesting seasonal dynamics that we've heard about a little bit, I think, throughout the day, where over the course of the year in northern Florida, we're looking at an increase in precipitation. But in South Florida, there is some suggestion, the model suggests that there will be drying in the summertime and then more precipitation in the wintertime. So these sort of divergent trends. And I think for any resource managers we've talked about, it's like dealing with those divergent trends is a challenge. One other thing I'll point out is that the increase in precipitation is projected to be larger than that decrease I was talking about in summer. So I know we do get rainfall in summer. So it's maybe like, a few percent less compared to this 10% increase that we're talking about in the wintertime. And then when we talk about wilder, that could be, anything from these wet and dry periods kind of being superimposed upon each other more frequently. It's also an increase in the maximum wind speed that tropical cyclones can produce. So the First Street Foundation recently put out a report showing likelihood of increased wind speeds in these types of systems in the future. So warmer, wetter, and wilder, and not necessarily fun, right? But we can do it, and I'm going to get to that. But I want to put this in geographic context, because sometimes it's like not fun to hear like, oh, it's just going to get warmer, and like not have some sort of context to ground ourselves in. So here's two examples of two counties in Florida. So we have Hillsborough County on the top there, and then Marion County on the bottom. And on the left side, you're looking at average temperature. And we see that average temperatures have warmed about 1 degree Celsius in the past 20 to 30 years. And the climate model projections have captured this well. And then when we push them out into the future, we see about another degree by mid-century. And what I'll point out in that bottom figure on the left, that dashed red line, that is the average temperature in Hillsborough County. And then the blue behind it is what Marion County is projected to do. So Marion County by mid-century will look like the sort of Hillsborough County climate of today. So if all you cared about was average temperature, you might like move your operation north if you had that freedom to do that. But it's nuanced because there's extreme temperatures. We all know it can get very hot sometimes. There can be heat waves. And those heat waves are increasing a bit faster than the average temperature. And so in Marion County, we actually blow right by Hillsborough County's level of extreme heat by mid-century. So I think the lesson here is we need to look at the whole distribution. We need to think about how not just the average is changing, but how some of those extremes are changing too. Lastly, I think I want to talk about market shifts as well, because it's important to realize that like growers are integrating all sorts of different risks. It's not just pest and disease. It's not just climate. It's also economic risks. They have to like take that product to market and sell it. And what that looks like can really depend on what the overall structure of economy and trade is. So these authors, Porfirio, they recently put together a study where they looked at the structure of global trade. And they developed this index where when that index value is low, you have a very centralized network with like one key producer that's exporting that elsewhere. And when that index is high, you have this sort of distributed network with lots of nodes where there can be this exchange. And when they looked at this historically, they've seen over time it's tended to increase. And that's true of the future as well. But there's this divergent trend with moderate emissions and high emissions, that in the moderate emissions scenario, the economy actually has the ability to develop this more distributed property, whereas it tends to be a little more centralized when it's in a high emission scenario. So I guess a question is, which of these is more resilient? Is it that centralized one, or is it this distributed one where you can take out one node and it's not so bad, right? So it's that distributed network, I would argue, that is more resilient ultimately in the end. So there's this question, where are we on emissions, right? If there's this difference between moderate emissions and high emissions, where are we? Well, I guess the bad news is that emissions continue to rise. They've marched upwards for about the past 40 or 50 years or longer, save for some small drops when there's been times of economic turmoil, whether that's an oil energy crisis, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the global financial crisis, or most recently in the COVID-19 pandemic. There have been these little blips, but it tends to rebound and it tends to keep going up. So what do we do about that? Well, the first milestone is getting that emissions curve to flatten out. Can we just flatten the curve and stop increasing emissions? The second milestone is, can we bend that curve downward? And then, of course, the long-term goal, if you want a stable climate, you have to stabilize atmospheric CO2 concentrations. And to do that, you have to get back down to what you might hear called net zero. Net zero is just a balance between emissions and then capture, whether that's in natural processes like, absorbing in the land, absorbing in the water, or like literally pulling it out with trees that we've planted, or with artificial processes, chemical and mechanical processes. So the International Energy Agency has looked at this, and they have big ambition about, well, how do we get to net zero by 2050? And in this image, you see the different contributions from electricity and heat, from industry, from transport, from buildings, and so on. And they have like flagged in there some of these goals that we need to do. For example, no new abated coal plants approved for development. No new oil and gas fields approved for development. Well, we had some kind of like contrary news to that recently in the US, right? Development of hydrogen and a hydrogen economy, getting to 60% of global car sales that are electric by 2030. Right now, we're at about 10%. So I guess like the point I'm trying to make here is these are very ambitious goals. Do we agree? These are very ambitious. And so like there's a question, what if we don't hit these ambitious goals? Like what other tools do we have to face the challenges that are coming our way? And of course, the answer, the title of the whole talk is adaptation, right? Adaptation is something, it's not new. We've always been doing this. That's why we have this advanced civilization. We've figured out ways to fit our systems to the environment that they operate in. And that's not going to change. I think that what's going on now is that the pace of change is increasing, and then the complexity of these cascading risks I talked about, climate, pests and disease, market shifts, like it's becoming more intricate and subtle. And I think we've heard today that just like being swept along, doing nothing, like that's not going to work anymore. And so what are some of these strategies, you might call them, that we can use? Well, I'm going to tell you about 3 of them. First one is what we might call migration, or shifting geography. And we've seen this already around the world. The Corn Belt has shifted. We now have corn being grown in southern Canada and in North Dakota. We have wheat being grown further north in Europe. And here in our part of the country down here, citrus has been started to be grown in Georgia. This is Joe Franklin, who has started a farm there. The challenge with, shifting geography is that it's not necessarily an option to everyone. For one, some people might have the resources to move. For 2, some people are tied to their place, right? And they don't want to move. Like there is that connection. And I think that, there will be those who can move. And I think that will help buffer the system a bit. But there is another strategy, which we might call transformation. That is another option. So, citrus has really been challenged heavily. Like if you're not aware of that, I don't know what rock we've been living under, but it's been very challenged. And there are growers who are open to changing and have started to look at new crops. So this is the Pongamia tree, which produces a legume that can be used for oil. It can be turned into flour. It could be used for protein. And it's being piloted right now in Florida. It's being grown here. It's been grown in other parts of the country too, as a replacement for citrus. And I think the thing to note here is that like the first proof point is just proving the potential. Like it's not, farmers don't just like make, they don't just make wholesale changes to their operation. It's like testing it out, piloting it, see does it work? Is there a market there? So there are roles for other sort of boundary organizations to help here. And I think that's going to be key. And that's going to be my last point in adaptation, is that there's a role for more than just the growers or different parts of the system. Lastly is shifting technology or innovation. You heard about that in both of the talks that preceded mine. There are ways that we can keep agriculture in place in Florida looking very similar to what it currently looks at, but with new technologies. So for example, there are new fabrics to be put into the field for mulching that are lighter colors that can help reflect sunlight, keep the temperature down. These are being explored as we speak. There are also shade fabrics where shade fabrics can be used, both in the greenhouse context or out in the field, that can help reflect some sunlight, produce more diffuse light, which plants like, and can, help also keep the temperature up at night if that's important, by, re-radiating back down some of that long wave energy that's going out. There's also really interesting cooling technologies that are starting to come out, whether they're thermoelectric or heat pumps. Some of these cooling technologies can help both workers and the produce that's actually produced. So when it comes out of the field, it can go into cooling right away, make it to market. So a lot of these different technologies are going to be infrastructure, but then there are also information technologies like we heard about, like agroclimate. These are critical technologies that growers can use in their operations to help reduce input costs and actually produce more. So I think when you think about innovation, there's a huge opportunity there. So at 2 Degrees Adapt, we highly recommend that Florida stakeholders involved in agriculture have the strategy of planning and preparing and piloting a variety of technologies, a variety of strategies. And I think a lot of these things already exist. Sure, there are new opportunities that are going to come along all the time, like the Pongamia tree. But there are strategies, proven strategies out there. There are information technologies out there that we can be piloting now. And I think the importance of using a broad array of technologies is because that gives you that flexibility to meet the challenges as they come, right? You've kind of looked around the corner. I think there's this view of heads down, and I get that people are focused on today and the problems of today. But I think we have to find ways to help each other look around the corner or look to the horizon, because that's going to help us anticipate those things as they come in, and it'll get us out of this sort of reactive mode. And I think that's why we're all here, right? So my closing message really is that we can transcend this sort of hero, villain, victim framework by becoming better partners to each other. And I think when these characters can partner together, it's solving the challenges together. It's meeting that adversity together. And I think we saw that in the response to the hurricane. And I think we can see that in other challenges. It's not just events, but it's meeting these climate challenges as they come on. So I think what I'll leave you with is really this question, or these questions of who can you reach out to and try to partner with, and what can you contribute to those, whether that's you individually or an organization that you represent. What can you bring to that partnership that will help us, come up with new strategies for agriculture, and really help us go from this heads down mode to looking out at the horizon. So thanks very much.
All right. Thanks, everybody. I'm sure you guys have been cooking on some good questions while we've been going through this, but I'm just grateful to the panel for kind of leaving us all with a really optimistic place, that there are solutions, that climate conferences can get a little doom and gloomy. And I'm walking away sort of feeling a little bit better about what we've got ahead of us. I'll try to maybe move this over here so I can read some of these questions. We've got a bunch. Let's see. I'm not sure who they are all to, so we're just going to let folks go with whatever they feel ready to answer. I will start at the top left. So, to the water utility seeking resilience funds. That's not a question. Okay. Is it arguable that all near coastal property damage can be termed as flood damage when wind, record rain, and slow storm movement preceded and accompanied the surge? I'm not sure who that question's to.
I'll give it a shot. I think it's a combination, but when the closer you are to the coast, the more susceptible you are to storm surge. When I was in emergency management, the planning was designed to get people out of the surge zone. And then in 1988, Hurricane Hugo changed the way states and local governments plan for hurricanes, because they saw the effects of wind and rain and water 150 miles further inland. So as an emergency manager, you want to protect life first. So you want to get people out of the surge zone. But the water is being driven by wind. So you can't divorce the wind from the water, because the wind is what's moving the water.
So just trying to connect these questions a little bit to the topics that we talked about. But you know, when we look at government buyout programs, are there currently those available for those repeated flood properties? Because we're going to see more uninsurable properties kind of coming into the market.
There used to be buyout programs as a condition of a federal disaster declaration. The state appoints a hazard mitigation coordinator, and the hazard mitigation coordinator's responsibility is to look at the damage, look at ways to mitigate that damage going forward. And if there's property or properties that have a documented history of damage, then buying that property instead of rebuilding it may be the smart thing to do. Not that government always does the smart thing, but.
Great. There's a question here about the Army Corps of Engineers study in Collier County, and I'll go ahead and take facilitator privilege on this one. So Collier County has a bit of a second bite at the apple to work on a storm surge study, a storm surge project with the Army Corps of Engineers. In a previous iteration, there was kind of a stall out where the design that was proposed by the Army Corps of Engineers was deemed acceptable by Collier County. There is a narrow window now that we can, with the support of the county, who has yet sort of officially opted in to getting back on board with coming up with a new design with the Army Corps to prevent storm surge. If they don't begin planning, if they don't opt in and begin planning pretty quickly, we will not be given the right timeline to get the completion of the planning and NEPA process for the next Federal Water Resource Development Act. What that means is if Collier County moves too slow, we lose $3 billion of federal investment for storm surge in Southwest Florida. That's, you know, and so I will direct folks. EDF has done a bunch of work on this. My colleague Rachel Rohde's in the back of the room and is leading on this work. We'll be having some subsequent conversations so I can share with Jennifer to distribute, but there are much more resources. I won't derail this conversation. How can we ensure our aquifers are protected from the effects of climate change?
Sure. So this is something we've been looking at, not just in Florida, but elsewhere as well. And I think that from like a water balance perspective, it's very important to understand what water use is going to and how that's changing over time. And then especially like, you know, here in Florida with the Florida aquifer, understanding, are there opportunities to do recharge or to like add a buffer from seawater? So we're, you know, putting water back down into the aquifer to help prevent that salinization process from happening. So that would be my comment, would be watching usage and then looking at new technologies for recharge.
Quick comment on that one as well. In terms of protecting the groundwater, in terms of nutrient leaching, we have several fields that are irrigation by seepage. I mean, they irrigate through the surface to the root zone. And we need to start incorporating weather forecasting in that system, because if we know there is an extreme rainfall event coming, we need to lower the water table before it gets flooded and then wash the nutrients again. So I think that there are ways we can improve what's there, especially in terms of protecting the water quality.
Is water farming an option to do that? Would that do that?
What do you mean by water farming?
The Department of Environmental Protection has a program where landowners can store water on their property, and then eventually it seeps down. But I would think if you're looking to lower the table, that having that water on top of it would do that.
Yeah. I mean, if you have anything that increase your flexibility with the system, I think it would be welcome. That's not what we're looking, especially is more in terms of where you have already high water table, that you would manage that better. Yeah, I think that if you can have water storage, that if you need, you have the ability to use that. That's also a welcome thing.
I'll throw this next one to Brian because I think he knows the answer. Is have farmers already begun to shift crops based on weather conditions?
I talked about it a little bit in the talk, but you know, we've seen farmers that are definitely looking at where their land is or the farms that they grow on, and to look at, what are the suitable crops for that. In Florida, there have been a number of other ideas besides the Pongamia tree, where we've looked at other crops that have been suggested. And I think, growers are always kind of thinking about, what they're going to do. And I think socializing those opportunities amongst the ag community are very important. Just as much as like coming up with new ideas, like getting those ideas communicated is very important, and finding ways to reach farmers and sort of diffuse that innovation out into the marketplace. That's very important.
There is an interesting crop being evaluated in North Florida in the Panhandle called the carinata, or Ethiopian mustard. It's actually a cover crop that can be harvested and the aviation fuel. It can be transformed to that. So there are some challenges because it's not short enough at this point. It delays the summer crop, which you don't want to do that. But there are some interesting options there they're exploring.
Interesting. Dr. Fraisse, maybe you're a good one to answer the question about acres in Hendry County that have taken down the 6 citrus trees. What options are there for them to find other crops for harvest? Do you have any familiarity with other alternatives for Hendry County planting?
Not
Fair enough. All right. I guess for anyone who wants to take this one, what is the biggest threat? I'm going to reword this one a little bit. Is the biggest threat for farming in Florida the loss of acreage or the loss of revenue?
I mean, I guess I think it's more on the revenue side. I think that growers in some places are operating like at the margins of profitability. So that's why tools like agroclimate are so important to help farmers, manage their resources effectively and kind of manage inputs. The challenge is, having worked in decision support, that like if you have like something you can hedge on, like over applying an input, often that's like done just as, kind of it's a form of insurance in a way, right? And so there is like a social or like a behavioral component to like actually helping a grower use a decision support tool and actually, trusting that tool when it does make a recommendation to, and that's again the importance of social science. And I think that a lot more work can be done to kind of figure out how to make those little behavioral nudges for growers to actually kind of limit some of those inputs, because that'll help with profitability. And then for that matter, that'll probably help with the acreage too, and not losing as much. And I guess with acreage, I guess we think about citrus as helping growers think about alternatives if they do have to pull back.
That's great. Bob, question, thoughts on why, given all of the potential revenue loss to governments and businesses, why policymakers are not sort of jumping at the bit to make some policy shifts?
Oh, that's a loaded question. I think it boils down to what is important to the policymakers and to legislators, and I just haven't seen this being that important to them. Because usually it's policymakers tend to react to a crisis. There's very little proactive policy making. Something happens, you respond to it, you change a law, you change what we see. And I don't know how much of it we've seen down here, but in my dealing with past emergencies is hurricane comes through, and a lot of these slab on grade houses that have been built 40, 50 years ago in South Florida, they get damaged more than 50%. And if your property is damaged more than 50%, when you go to rebuild, you have to rebuild with new codes, and you have to elevate above the base flood elevation and things like that. And that adds a lot of money to the price of your house. And your insurance settlement probably isn't going to cover all of that. So property owners sell their property to developers. Developers, when they get enough of that property, then they'll put a condominium or something in its place. Or the other option that I've seen, the other thing that I've seen happen is the homeowners bring so much political pressure to politicians that they ignore the new requirements and they just permit it to be rebuilt exactly like it was, which accomplishes nothing from the hazard mitigation standpoint.
Yeah, understood. I'll take the other ever so light topic of the ESG stuff. And I'll just share that, you know, the ESG rules are showing up in Texas as having cost taxpayers lots of money because the government was restricted in where it could get loans, and that essentially made it a smaller market. And there actually is recorded losses. I'm not going to, you know, opine on what those numbers might look like for Florida, but ESG in general, we've seen that some of the anti-ESG policies have a real fiscal impact. You can jump in if you want to add to that, but okay. So Dr. Fraisse, is the total precipitation this year still a lot lower than in El Nino years, even factoring in the hurricanes? The question is trying to get at whether the flooding could have been worse if it was an El Nino.
The main answer there is that when you have an El Nino, your chances to have a hurricane decrease, by the way. So you really probably the two don't go together very much. It doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. It just means that your chances are much lower. So in terms of total precipitation, I really don't know. It depends where you are in Florida. We have seen the peninsula of Florida has been in the low range of precipitation. That's for sure. Okay, but you had Ian, and then I tend not to think about volume, but distribution, and that's how we think in agriculture. It doesn't matter, and there is some crop insurance, parametric insurance now that look at volume of rainfall. You get less than this, you get a payment. Well, it really doesn't matter for me because it's not the volume, it's the distribution that matters. So in terms of agriculture, really what matters is the distribution of rainfall, not the total volume that you have.
It's helpful. This one to Brian. Do you have projections for which crops will become extinct due to the climate impacts in Florida, and how do we stop it from happening?
Yeah, I mean, I guess extinct just means no longer grown here. I mean, I think we've started to look at what the impacts will be, and you know, for certain crops, it looks like a reduction yield. And so what actually makes it go extinct is not so much that you can't grow it here, but that growers decide that it won't be profitable. And so they choose not to grow it here. I think that will be more of the impact. And for that, it's like a social issue where we have to like talk to growers and understand what sort of levers they have and can control. I know there have been projections of citrus that, you know, it's going to be pretty decimated, you know, long term. And it's just a matter of like, can we, you know, come up with innovative ways of responding to this greening disease? You know, and I think talking about innovation, like there's going to be opportunities for new crops here too. And so I think we have to balance the sort of view that certain crop won't be grown here with new opportunities for different cropping systems. I did see that other question about who's leading these opportunities to buy back land and then put conservation easements on it, or agriculture easements. That's it's like rural and family lands protection program with the state. So you can look into that.
All right. Well, I'll throw in one last question that seems to be curious about where tomatoes are being grown in Florida.
Immokalee, Palm Beach County. Yeah, those are the big ones. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Awesome.
All of the trucks, right?
All right. Well, thank you again to the panel and to the audience for the great questions, sticking with us.